What's up, everybody? David Yakir here for Yak About Today, hoping you are better, healthier, and more informed than any generation that came before. So if the years 46 to 64 mean something to you, then this is the place you want to be. Now put your headphones on, go for a run, and listen to what we yak about today. Okay, David here, and I've been thinking, this one will catch you by surprise, I've been thinking about love. Great love for that matter, or even love affairs, and more importantly, what love looks like in the wiser years. So that's what we'll yak about today. I'm thinking you are probably used to listening to a female voice when the discussion comes up in the media, but today you got me, and that's not really that important. So I'll tell you, what made me think about love was two love stories that I was sort of privy to recently, and they both moved me and gave me insight into how great love can be as we age. But as usual, we'll get to those in a bit. So for me, I've always been fascinated by the stories of the great love affairs in both history, literature, and although I think I, like many people, use the words love affair, I think we use them in the wrong way. So for those of you who are not familiar with the actual dictionary of love affair, it means a love affair is a romantic and usually sexual relationship between two people who love each other but who are not married or living together. And my guess is that breaking the current rules of engagement in love that we follow is what makes the love affair so enticing and romantic. So there were great love affairs in history and literature, and they nearly changed the world. I don't know if many of you know this, but wars were fought, a lot of geniuses were inspired, and these stories will never, ever be forgotten. So, as usual, I'll try to share some of these great stories in history. Now, the first one you know, and the one I've been most fascinated with, is that of Helen of Troy. Now, if you didn't know, she was another man's wife, but when Paris, who was the handsome prince of Troy, saw Helen, the woman who Aphrodite proclaimed the most beautiful in the world, he decided he had to have her. And Helen and Paris ran off together, and they set in motion a decade-long Trojan War. And according to the myth, Helen was half divine, the daughter of Queen Leda and the god Zeus, and we'll never know the true story, of course, but her romantic part in the greatest epic of all time can never be forgotten. She will forever be the face that launched 1,000 ships. So I'm sure I've heard the expression so many times, and you've heard it, but I'm not sure many people knew that the face that launched 1,000 ships was Helen of Troy. All right, this one's an easy one to sort of figure out. So if I said she was brilliant to look upon and to listen to, with the power to subjugate everyone, that was the description of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. She could have had anything or anyone she wanted, but she fell passionately in love with the Roman general Mark Antony. And as Shakespeare depicts it and wrote, their relationship was volatile. Cleopatra says to Mark Antony, "Fool, don't you see now that I could have poisoned you 100 times had I been able to live without you?" But after they risked all in a war on Rome, and they lost, they chose to die together in 30 BC. In Shakespeare, at the end, Mark Antony says, "I will be a bridegroom in my death," and run into it as to a lover's bed. And Cleopatra followed by clasping a poisonous asp to her breast. The next story of a great love is actually between two men. Now, we've heard of the Wall. not the wall that you're thinking about, but this is in the 2nd century A.D., and it was a wall stretching across England when Rome was trying to subjugate England. The story is of Emperor Hadrian and how he lost his heart to Antonis, an intelligent and sports-loving Greek student. They said the emperor had such an obsessive craving for his presence. The two traveled together, pursuing their love of hunting. Hadrian once saved the lover's life during a lion hunt. The emperor even wrote erotic poetry to him. While visiting the Nile, Antonis drowned mysteriously, some say murdered, by those jealous of the emperor's devotion. The devastated Hadrian proclaimed Antonis a deity and ordered a city to be built in his honor and named a star after him between the eagle and the zodiac. And perhaps the last, and this is the last one, and most unusual story, is that of Dante and Beatrice. So rarely has a woman served as such a profound inspiration for a writer, and yet he barely knew her. The Italian poet Dante Alighieri wrote passionately of Beatrice in the Divine Comedy and other poems, but, listen to this, only met the object of his affection twice. The first time, he was 9 years old, and she was 8. The second time, they were adults, and while walking on the street in Florence, Beatrice, an emerald-eyed beauty, turned and greeted Dante before continuing on her way. So Beatrice died at the age 24 in 1290, without Dante ever seeing her again. And nonetheless, she was the glorious lady of my mind, he wrote, and she is my beatitude, the destroyer of all vices and the queen of virtue and salvation. So these are just a few stories, and honestly, there are so many of these stories that, I don't know, it sounds a little funny here when I say this, but after reading, a lot of them, for a moment, I think you're inspired to recreate the love you might have, or to search for that romantic love of myth. And of course, most likely, we all get disappointed at some point. But there are stories that are pretty amazing, two of which I think are worthwhile sharing, and the stars of these stories are the wiser and more mature of us. Now that's important. So one note, I've changed the names to protect their privacy, of course, and parts of the stories are filled in based on the conversation I've had with these people or observation I've made. So the first story is about Aunt Rachel, and we'll call her Aunt Rachel. So Aunt Rachel was actually the youngest of 7 children. She was my father's baby sister. She is currently 77 years young, and we were at a family gathering, and I hadn't seen Rachel since her husband had died. As family often do when we get together after a long time, we sort of share stories. Now, Aunt Rachel's story really caught my attention, kind of surprising. So as we were catching up, she wanted to tell me a story about the love of her life and the greatest love affair she could have imagined. Now, listen, this is the story about my Aunt Rachel that I remember, right? So she was about 21 and she got married, and about 2 years later, she was divorced. Now, I was probably too young to know why, and probably at the time I didn't really care. But a few years later, she met her husband, and we'll call him Ben. Ben was a comedian, musician, and ultimately a great school teacher, like she was. They seemed really madly in love, and I'm not sure of the length of the marriage, but it could really have been about 30 or so years, or maybe even more. I went to visit years ago as Ben was suffering from Parkinson's disease, which I knew fairly well because my father also suffered from it. And we talked for a while as Aunt Rachel and Ben held hands. Ben did what he usually does, and that's tell jokes and sing a song. But through it all, you could see the suffering underneath. I knew from my dad's experience that Ben wouldn't be around for long, and indeed, he died a year or two later. I didn't get to go to the funeral, but I always felt for my aunt. I thought they were a great love story. But when we met up, the love affair she told me about was a different one. And it goes like this. When Aunt Rachel was even younger than the first failed marriage, she met a man. We will call him Daniel. She was so in love with Daniel, she told me that he was the only man she thought she could spend the rest of her life with. It was what they called a whirlwind romance. She told me that between the ages of 19 and 20 years old, all she did was think of him and want to be with him. She could never get him out of her mind. After dating Daniel for a long period of time, it was time to consider marriage. And when they talked about it, he said he had no interest in getting married, nor did he want children. She thought he would eventually come around, but as the time passed, he never changed his mind. Now, 60 years ago, times were different, so a woman was supposed to be married at a certain age, or the old-fashioned terms like old maid would be applied. She eventually moved on. She told me that the first marriage was sort of a rebound marriage to her great love, which is why it lasted only 2 years, but it taught her to manage her expectations. By the time she met Ben, the second marriage, my uncle, she was ready and loved him and raised a family. A few years after Ben's death, she ran into Daniel. They arranged to get together, to get reacquainted. They met for a dinner. As it turns out, Daniel never did get married, and that throughout his life, the greatest love he could remember was when he was with my Aunt Rachel when they were very young. So for the next 6 years, they didn't leave each other's side. They held hands, traveled, talked, and loved. It was the 6 years she had dreamed of all her life, as he did also. When he died, and I think it was of cancer, she told me that as a woman, she had been totally fulfilled. I asked her what she will do next. She was still a young 77. She said, now I'll travel, see my girls, and fall in love with the world. And people, that's important. So I have to go watch the time now. So let's take a break and hear from our great sponsor and our advertisers. But when I see you on the other side, I'll tell you the story of a 93-year-old woman and her chef in his early 60s. I want to take a moment to talk to you about New Vision Eye Center. You know, for the last couple of years, they've been a sponsor of this show, and I couldn't be prouder. I've met so many people that have walked up to me and thanked me for recommending them. I hear all sorts of stories about how they've worked miracles. And as you know, I've been a patient of New Vision Eye Center for years. So when I say go see Dr. Minotti, Reinauer, Tate, and O'Brien, it's because I wouldn't trust my eyes to anyone else. So, we are back. So now I want to give you really what our next story is, and that's the story of the 93-year-old woman and her chef in his early 60s. So we will name them. We'll call her Mamie, and we'll call him Gil. So Gil is a personal chef, and because of his nature, he has developed a clientele of the generation before the ones I call the wiser and more mature. So when Gil was recommended to Mamie, there seemed to have been an immediate bond. She was an English woman who was wise and dramatic and sometimes naughty in the way a woman could be naughty in the 1930s or 40s. And at the beginning, Gil tells me the conversations were short, mostly about food, what she liked and didn't like. But as they got to know each other, his stays at her condo on the beach were longer and longer. They got to the point that on the days he delivered her food, they would sit and have tea on the veranda. She would tell him stories of England during the war and how she met her American husband, who had passed away 6 years ago, that he loved listening to her stories. And Gil loved listening to her stories. She would ask him about his life and his family and his mother. She took a special interest in his relationship and marriage. And as I learned later, on the days that Gil was there, she would awake early, have her hair done, put on her makeup and dress to greet him at the door. One day, when Gil was sick, he actually asked me if I could deliver the food to Mamie. And I agreed, and I loved the idea of seeing Mamie. And when I got to the door, she greeted me really lovingly. She was a wonderful woman, but slightly disappointed that it wasn't Gil. And she was kind enough to invite me for tea. So we had a sort of an immediate wonderful kinship, not quite like Gil had, right? As we both had a great deal of knowledge, particularly about old movies from the late 30s and early 40s. Her from living through it, and obviously me by watching TCM. She then talked about her late husband, their life together, and how much Gil and he were alike. And when she talked about Gil, she thought he was the finest man she had ever met since her late husband. In fact, he shared many of the qualities of her husband. He was the most caring, unselfish person she had ever met. She went on and on about him. And of course, I'm wondering if this was the same person I knew so well. So anyway, she had recommended a movie, and this was particularly interesting. It was called Mrs. Paltrow at the Claremont, and it was a 2005 movie, which I watched, starring Joan Plowright and Rupert Friend, and it was about a woman abandoned by her family in a London retirement hotel who strikes up a curious friendship with a young writer. Now, my take of the movie is that although it was an unusual friendship, they both found that not only did they need one another, but the relationship they developed was a fulfilling one. It definitely was about a great love story between two people who needed companionship and, more importantly, someone to care about. The next time I had seen Mamie was when she was having difficult hip problems and had to spend some time in a pain management center. And at 93, you sort of always worry whether someone at the age will get a chance to go home. So when Gil and I got there, we decided it was kind of a warm and sunny day, so we'd go out and sit on the bench. Now, this was really when I saw it. The entire time, Gil and Mamie were holding hands and staring into one another's eyes. And sort of as they gazed at each other, I realized, and this was my take, that maybe they weren't just seeing one another. As I looked at Mamie's eyes, I thought maybe she was seeing her late husband in Gil's eyes. And in return, I thought Gil, who had always been so close to his mother until she passed, had found another. Of course, those were my thoughts, but it didn't dissuade me from thinking that this was a great love. Now, that's really important, right? Romantic love has been described as sort of a human universal or near universal, and is associated usually with intense emotional experiences such as increased energy, euphoria, obsessive thinking about the loved one, feelings of dependency and craving. When people are in love, they may feel as if they have uncovered the meaning of life. And people often report feeling complete and their life feels whole. But there is a slight difference between the more mature set and the youngins, because the top 5 most highly rated elements of successful romantic relationships for older adults were honesty, communication, companionship, respect, and positive attitude, whereas the top 5 most highly rated elements of romantic relationship success for younger adults were love, communication, trust, attraction, and compatibility. So, there you have it. Love affairs, and great love. I just want to thank the people and the research that helped me put this together. The names are below if you're listening to this and reading this online. I'll be back in a moment. Hey, boys and girls, how about a little self-promotion here? As many of you know, Yak About Today is produced by the David Yakir Group for iHeartMedia. Now, we are a digital-focused producing group that creates content and conversations built to engage our client partners with their audience. We do this by creating the best content on the strongest messaging foundation with a diversity in the media delivery formats. So, if your goal is to get you, your message, and your business out there in the digital media universe and are interested in working with the David Yakir Group, then give us a call at 212-244-6224. That's 212-244-6224, or write to us at info@yakirgroup.com. That's info@yakirgroup.com. Okay, I don't think I'll have enough time to really do a Yak About Tech segment today, but just know that I'm working on, and I've been thinking, piece on technology and how it's used and how it benefits the more mature crowd. So I'll get that ready for you guys in the next couple of weeks, and I think that'll work for you. I do have just one little story. I have a friend up in New York that is really not computer savvy at all, and had really been struggling years and years ago. Somebody put a Windows computer on his desk, and he had no knowledge really of how to use it. He knew how to turn it on. He knew how to bring up his browser, but that was the extent of what he used on his computer, just the browser. So back then he would have AOL Mail, which most people did back then, and he would use that, and of course he would browse all the sites he was interested in, which made sort of the operating system sort of non-event for him. When that computer finally was dying and on its last breath, he asked me to help him, and I had two options. One was a Chromebook, which is basically a browser-operated system. The second was an iPad, and everybody here knows I'm a big fan of the iPad. So I got him the Chromebook, and his experience with it is really fantastic for people who have no knowledge. And I'll talk about that later at another time. And the second thing he decided to buy was the iPad. So he bought both of the devices that I had recommended. And I want to tell you another time about his experience and how I think it's important for you. And maybe I'll include it in the I've Been Thinking segment on technology. So we're sort of out of time now. And I'll see you next week on the other side. Peace. And once again, I want to say thanks to our listeners for staying tuned in. Because of you, we are now carried on some of the largest podcasting systems worldwide, from iHeartRadio, iTunes, and TuneIn, to Spreaker and Blueberry in the U.S., to iVooc in Spain and South America, and Omni Studio in Australia. And chances are, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to stay in touch, look for Yak About Today on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or write to us at yakabouttoday@gmail.com. And, of course, if you like us that much, download the Yak About Today mobile app on the App Store. This is David Yak here, and until next week, yak amongst yourselves. Peace.
Take out the papers and the trash, or you don't get no spending cash. If you don't scrub that kitchen floor, you ain't gonna rock and roll no more. Yakety yak,
Don't talk back.
just finish cleaning.